Okay, so the volume unfortunately remains an issue. I'm sorry about that. I can't do anything until I get a new laptop. I've heard these videos myself. I know the volume is really not great. So all I can say is you may need to use headphones to listen to this. I want to talk about the the Bush presidents, both of them, and it seems like an apt time with the passing of Bush 41. I don't intend this to be a hugely comprehensive video, but I want to touch on some of the main criticism, particularly focusing on foreign policy. I'm not going to get so much into the conspiracy theory side of things about the connection of the Bush family to the Third Reich with Prescott Bush and all that sort of stuff. Because the thing about conspiracy theories is those videos are viral. They already have massive attention. Um, and I'm just not interested in pandering to it any further. I'm not saying that there's nothing there. I do think that there's some murky aspects to the Bush family. There's no question about it. I think wherever you have power, there's going to be murky aspects. However, I still think some of the vilification is unfair, and I'm going to try and explain why. Just a disclaimer here or a footnote. Back at the time of the Iraq War in 2003, I was fiercely critical of George W. Bush. I still think that war was a complete disaster. However, in the time since then, and I think I made a similar video to this about Tony Blair when he stepped down from office. One thing that you notice about Bush haters, and this is not everyone, but a lot of Bush haters, they say things like, oh, Bush 41 is going to be dancing in hell, these demons don't deserve, da 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 da. They're really vilified. I mean, more so than most presidents, I would say. And it's time to really reflect on some of these things and challenge some of the arguments that people are putting out there to vilify the Bushes. So let's start with Afghanistan. That's with Bush too. What was the backdrop to Afghanistan in 2001? We talk about the conflict beginning in 2001. It didn't. It began in 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and you had a secular communist state trying to impose communism on a deeply conservative religious country. Clearly, that was not going to happen. And the way Soviet troops behaved in Afghanistan caused a lot of bitterness and a lot of resentment. And eventually, after years of chaos, the Soviets, of course, withdrew in 1989. There was a civil war. The Taliban rose to power. Now, there are those who say that the United States helped them rise to power because they funded the Mujahideen. And the Reagan administration, has culpability for that, without question. But if we're going to talk about the situation in Afghanistan, you cannot talk about it without looking at the fact that the Soviet Union invaded a country that, whilst very religiously conservative, only became far more so after the invasion. So I would say the Soviet Union, which is now gone, but its successor state, Russia, has completely whitewashed that. When do you ever hear in Russia today, when they're criticizing the coalition policy in Afghanistan, when do you ever hear their role? Never. So let's just start with that fact that the Soviet Union bears a very large part of responsibility for the mess that is in Afghanistan that has continued for the past 40 years. Now, the next fact is the Taliban provided safe haven for Al Qaeda. They may not have directly attacked the United States, but they provided a safe haven for the terrorists who did. And again, this is where questions about the Bush family's links to Saudi Arabia come in, but that doesn't exonerate the Taliban. And the problem I have with a lot of Bush critics is they vilify the Bushes, right? But they say nothing about the Taliban. They say nothing about Saddam, which I'm going to come to. Why not? Are the Taliban not responsible for their own actions? I have a real big problem with that when it comes. I mean, this is something you see with criticism of Western foreign policy in general. It's always a case of vilifying the United States and Britain, but never looking at other players. And I have a big problem with that. Um, let's be clear about the Taliban, a vicious, theocratic, fascist, Islamofascist dictatorship that stoned women in public, that treated women effectively as slaves, that hanged men for having the wrong beard length, that banned music, that banned dancing. Um, I mean, it was a hideous, horrible religious dictatorship. And when people attack Bush, I think they tend to forget that or they overlook it. Now, surely the removal of the Taliban or challenging the Taliban's power, I think it needs to be seen as an illegitimate government. Challenging that surely in itself is not a bad thing. So those who hate the Bushes, what would you have done? What would you have done post 9/11? Can any Bush critic actually answer that question? I honestly think any president in his position would have had to show a hard line. So it's very easy to vilify George W. Bush, but no one, even FDR, because the attack on Pearl Harbor, the anniversary of which was yesterday, 77 years, that wasn't even on the mainland. No president has been in that position that George W. Bush was in. And I think in any fair assessment of his legacy, that needs to be considered. The weight of responsibility that he had to face. And it's very easy to throw stones when you're not in the seat. But I think history will probably judge his response kinder. Now, with Iraq, it gets more murky. Let's look at the first Gulf War with Bush 41. People say the Bushes are responsible for millions of deaths in Iraq. That needs to be questioned for a start. First Gulf War. What is the facts? The fact is Saddam Hussein, a genocidal dictator, invaded the sovereign state in Kuwait, a smaller state, incidentally. Saddam Hussein is the dictator who launched the Iran-Iraq War. Saddam Hussein is the dictator responsible for tens of thousands of deaths of Kurds in the Al-Anfal campaign of 1987-88. Saddam Hussein was one of the most evil, sadistic, brutal, and callous dictators in modern times, and can anyone rationally dispute that? So, that first Gulf War, which had large UN mandate, was, in my view, morally justified. Now, there is an argument that Bush Sr. should have went further and finished the job, so to speak. Maybe he should have. But, history is history, and what happened, happened. Do you think you would find any Kuwaitis who would say, oh no, the world's biggest superpower should have just ignored the situation? I don't think so. So I'm sick and tired of people not attributing any responsibility to Saddam. Then comes the UN sanctions, which of course led to an estimated 500,000 Iraqi civilian deaths. An awful situation due to lack of medicine and so on throughout the 1990s. Now, on one hand, you could say it's the fault of the UN because they imposed the sanctions, and that was spearheaded by Bush Sr. But consider this, it was Saddam Hussein who put his country in that situation. It's a bit like the apologists for Nicolas Maduro and Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, the usual left wing apologists for dictators. They blame everyone but the Venezuelan leadership. And it's the same when it comes to Iraq. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that every Bush critic is a Saddam apologist, far from it. But there are many who frankly are, because they will not condemn Saddam. They will not recognize his central role in that by defying UN sanctions. Iraq 2. Now, this is a lot harder to justify because the fact is the coalition were the aggressors. At the time, I opposed that Iraq war, and I still think it was a disaster. Um, I think the focus of Bush and Blair on WMDs was a mistake because they felt that would get international support. Saddam had used chemical weapons in the Al Anfal campaign, but he hadn't used WMDs at that point. So it was never going to get wider international support, certainly not the sort of UN mandate that Afghanistan had. And that's understandable because whereas the intervention in Afghanistan could be seen as a defensive war, i.e., it was a direct response to 9/11, Iraq had no connection to 9/11. and that's where things get um, controversial, to say the least. I think it was a disaster, and it's hard to justify it. Nevertheless, even those Iraqis who are fiercely critical of American intervention, you'll find few of them that would openly praise Saddam. They hated Saddam. They didn't want their country occupied, but they hated Saddam. So then the question comes, was the removal of Saddam Hussein, a genocidal dictator, in itself a bad thing? I would say no, it wasn't. I would say the post-war situation was a terrible thing. I would say the obsession with WMDs, and obviously with Iraq then comes the oil situation because people will say it's all about oil. Now, I think it would be very naive to pretend that isn't corruption in the corridors of power in Washington with people like Dick Cheney and Halliburton and all the rest of it. And you get populist left-wing filmmakers like Michael Moore who only show one side of the story, and it's all one massive conspiracy theory. It's all to grab Iraqi oil. That makes a great story, right? But I think the reality is more complex, and I think the removal of Saddam in itself was a good thing. He was a thoroughly evil man, and I don't think anyone could rationally suggest otherwise. His sons were thugs. Um, so if you're going to vilify the Bushes, all I would say is look at the other side as well. I'm not saying that there isn't valid condemnation to be made of both President Bushes. I think they both have blood on their hands. I mean, Bush Sr. is also implicated in the Iran-Contra affair, and incidentally, Ronald Reagan gets exonerated quite a lot. I think there should be more scrutiny of the Reagan administration and its dirty wars in Latin America. So I don't want to come across as a cheerleader for both Bushes, but I do think a lot of that vilification, and the same applies to the attacks on Tony Blair, exonerate the other side. They exonerate Saddam Hussein and they exonerate the Taliban, and I'm sick of it because I think that's wrong. I think the Taliban was a vicious death cult, and their removal from power was a good thing. The war obviously drags on. It may be that some sort of negotiation is the only way forward, but there must never ever be a situation where they're allowed to get into government in Afghanistan again. Nation building doesn't happen overnight. You can't take a country that has experienced medieval theocracy and think it's going to become a democracy the next day. That isn't going to happen. But those who vilify NATO, particularly the United States, would do well just for once to actually answer the question, what would they do instead? Because they're very good at vilifying uh, both Presidents Bush's, but they will not provide any sort of alternative. That's what I would like to hear. So, what is the alternative? Keep Saddam in power, keep the Taliban in power. There's a clip in one of the Michael Moore films, and I used to be a fan of Michael Moore, but now I realize he's pretty much a left wing populist, almost a left wing Donald Trump in a sense. But basically, there's a scene where it shows Baghdad just before the war, and it's done in such a way as to make it think it's a nice, peaceful land where everyone's happy. It shows children on swings, it shows people, barbers and so on. But that whitewashes the fact that this was a dictatorship. People were living in fear. People were tortured and murdered and executed and purged if they dared defy Saddam. So I think the war was a disaster. I still think it was probably wrong footed, but I just wish people would look at both sides.